5.2, banks and balance sheets, continuing on with money within the economy. So 5.2 is going to look at a few things, specifically this idea of the fractional reserve banking system in the US and why that exists. We're going to differentiate between required and excess reserves. We'll talk about liabilities and assets. And finally, we're going to define the money multiplier and explain how it's used in order for banks to create money. That's going to be ultimately kind of the big idea that we look at here. So first of all, what are banks used for? We've all been in the bank. We all know about banks, and we know that we store and save money there. They can make loans like mortgages and things like that. They have credit cards and debit cards we can use for spending, and they provide interest for our savings. And we know all these things about banks. Like, we understand the purposes of banks, and we all keep our monies at banks, right? But what we need to understand and see is that, a lot of times I think there's this idea that there's this little vault with your name on it, with just like a little stack of cash in there, and anytime you come in, they just peel a little bit of money off the top and hand it back. But really, that's not how banking works. We live in this world where we have a fractional reserve system within the US, and we need to kind of understand what that is and what the implications of that are. So fractional reserve banking, you can kind of understand this just looking at the name of it, right? It's this idea that only a fraction of the total money supply is kept on hand at any one time, right? There's typically this number that is given to banks saying you have to hold on to a certain percentage. This is known as the required reserve ratio. It's this percentage that has to be kept on hand or reserved or set aside at the bank. We'll talk more about this as we go along. But this is, it's known as the fractional reserve banking system because, whenever you go and drop your money off at the bank, banks are only required to hang on to a fraction or hang on to a portion or reserve that of your money. So what we see is that a few different terms we're going to see. We have checkable deposits. Think about that just as like your bank account, money that's dropped off by you or by someone else at the bank. Reserves is any cash that's on hand at the bank. Now, this money that is at the bank, it can either be considered required reserves, like remember there's a percentage that they have to keep, but it can also be known as excess reserves. Excess is anything that's beyond what's required, and it's extra cash that like, hey, they don't have to keep there. But they do have it there, right? It's excess. It's left over. What we see is that the amount of required reserves that has to be kept is equal to the reserve ratio times the amount of checkable deposits. Remember that because that's really easy for people to get confused on. Sometimes they'll take the reserve ratio times total reserves, and that's not it. It's the reserve ratio times the checkable deposit equals required reserves. But then what do banks do with that excess reserves, right? We said that sometimes they have money beyond what they're required to keep there. Well, banks make loans, right? How else do banks make loans? Well, they take your money and they loan it out to other people. And so we're going to kind of look through an example of that by looking at banks' balance sheets, right? A balance sheet just shows assets and liabilities for any person, but in this case, for a bank, right? An asset is simply just anything that you own. A liability is what you owe, right? An asset is working for you. A liability is working against you. And so we'll see that we're going to actually balance these out on balance sheets. Now, the nice thing about balance sheets is they always balance. So whatever it's equal to on the right side, it's going to be equal to on the left side, the totals are, and vice versa. And so our assets are going to be our reserves, because that's cash that we have working for us, or any money that we've extended as a loan, because that money's working for us, right? It's earning us interest back as the borrower pays that back. Checking deposits, though, is a liability. If someone was to come back and say, hey, I want that money that I deposited here, we have to give that back to them. That's a liability. We owe that to them. It's their money. So as we go through this, we're going to say that we have a bank and it's going to start off brand new, absolutely nothing in it. But we're going to say our reserve ratio is going to be 10% through this story. So again, we have our balance sheet and it is filled with zeros because we're a new bank. Nothing's there. Now, again, this is completely hypothetical. These numbers are hypothetical. Like, keep that in mind as we go through this. We're just using a small example to make a big point. Let's say Alex comes and Alex makes a deposit of $1,000 at the bank, right? So what does our balance sheet look like? Well, remember, our reserve ratio is 10%. We're going to see that our checking deposits is $1,000 because Alex came and dropped off his $1,000. Therefore, our total liabilities, or the total amount of money we owe back to Alex, is $1,000. The total amount of money we owe total in our bank is $1,000. Well, then over on the other side, we know it has to balance out to $1,000 as well because balance sheets balance. Now, some of that money is required reserves. Well, how much of it? Well, we take 10% times 1,000. We find out that $100 of that is required, which leaves the other 900 as excess reserves in our bank. So let's say then we have Ben who comes along, and Ben says, hey, I want to buy a new bicycle. It's going to cost me $900, so I want to take out a loan. Well, what does the balance sheet look like then? Well, remember that deposit still stays at $1,000. And the reason it stays at $1,000 is because we still owe Alex that $1,000. If Alex came back and said, I want my money back, we owe him $1,000, right? That's a liability. Now over here, we see that it still balances out. Our required reserves is still $100, but that $900 has now moved from being excess to being a loan. We've loaned it out. We've extended it out. So then excess reserves is 0, all right? Well, then let's say that we have Claire who comes along, and Claire has an account in our bank, and Claire got her paycheck for the week, so she drops it off at the bank. Her paycheck was $1,500. Reserve ratio, still 10%. What does this look like? What happens? Our checking deposits now is going to be $2,500. Our total liabilities. Well, why $2,500? Well, remember, Alex dropped off $1,000. Claire dropped off $1,500. Both of those were their monies that they dropped off. We owe them that money back, right? Total assets is going to balance out to $2,500 as well. Our required reserves, remember, is equal to $2,500, our checking deposits, times 10%. That's $250. We see that we've already loaned out $900. And in order to get this to balance out, that means we also then have $1,350 left in excess reserves. Let's say Danielle then comes along, and Danielle wants to take out a loan for $900. She has to fix her air conditioner or something like that, right? So she takes out a loan for $900. Well, what happens? Again, checking deposits still stays $2,500. Required reserves is still going to be $250. But now what we see is we have to take some of that money out of our excess reserves and shift it to our loans. So now we've actually extended 2 separate $900 loans, one to Ben, one to Danielle, and we've loaned out a total of $1,800 then, which leaves $450 in excess reserves. Perfect. All right, let's say then that Alex from the beginning of the story comes back and says, hey, I want to take out $500 from my account. I need to have my car fixed. I need $500. Do we have enough money to give Alex? Well, let's look. This is how it was set up as we ended last time. Do we have enough money to give back to Alex? No. Well, if we look at it a little more carefully, if we just look at that at face value and we say we only have $450, like we can't give him back his $500. We have to understand that there's a couple different moving parts that happen as Alex comes back to ask for his $500. What we end up seeing is that whenever we set up our new balance sheet, the checking deposits that was $2,500 before is now only going to be $2,000. Well, why is it only $2,000? Remember, this $500 that Alex came to take out was his money. It wasn't a loan, it was his money. He said, hey, that money that I'm storing here, I want that back. So no longer are we liable for that $500 we give back to him, which means now that our required reserves is no longer $250, now it's only $200. And because $50 have shifted out of our required reserves into our excess reserves, we actually had the $500 to give him. Our loans is still $1,800. Now we have no money left in our excess, but it balances out to $2,000. We do have enough money to give back Alex. We can give him his $500 back. Now, again, we have to understand that there's moving parts. Like a couple different things are happening. If you were to just take that original setup and say, no, we only have $450, we can't give it back to him, you're not getting the whole picture, right? We have to see that, hey, Alex came and asked for $500 of his own money back. Because the checking deposits then goes down, so does the required reserves. Because the required reserves go down, less of that excess, or I guess I should say, less of that total reserves that are there, less of that total reserves we have to hang on to that gives us more in excess in order to loan back. Now again, these are all hypothetical. Banks have more money than this on hand at any given time. We're taking a small point to make a big, we're taking a small story to make a big point, right? So let's kind of take a look at everything that's happened in this story. Who all has money? Well, Alex had that $1,000, right? He originally deposited $1,000, $500 still at the bank, $500 he just took out for his car. Claire deposited $1,500 at the bank as well. That was her own money. Ben took out a $900 loan. Danielle took out a $900 loan. If we add all that up, we see that there's $4,300, but only $2,500 of actual real money was ever deposited at the bank. Yet we see $4,300 we have to the names of people. Well, where did that extra $1,800 come from? Well, the thing is, and this is what we need to understand about the fractional reserve banking system, is that whenever people receive loans, what happens is banks are actually creating money, right? They're making money. Let's take a little bit closer of a look at that, right? Alex and Claire took their actual money and deposited at the bank. But banks aren't required to hang on to all of their money. They loan some of it out. Now, as they loan out that money, the bank still has record that Alex and Claire have money in their accounts. Yet the physical, actual money they dropped off is no longer there. Therefore, money's being created out of thin air. It's kind of this weird way to think about it, this fractional reserve system, but that is essentially what's happening. Now, within our fractional reserve system, we see that we could have this whole loan deposit, loan deposit, loan deposit thing that could go on forever, right? Let's say Ben, buys that bicycle, and then the bicycle shop owner who received the $900 comes back and deposits it at the bank and drops off that $900 back at the bank, and then someone else comes out for a loan, and we give them a loan for $810, and then they go and they buy a new guitar, and then the guitar shop owner comes and they deposit the money back at the bank, and then it just goes back and forth, right? We could continue to have this loan deposit, and this is what it would look like, kind of long-handed out in an entire chart. But what's the maximum amount of money that could be created simply from just continuing to loan out someone's original deposit, right? Like if we just had that $1,000 from Alex and kept going back and forth, if we're saying banks are creating money, how much money might be created by the banks? Like what's the maximum amount? Well, we could go through and add all that up, but instead we have something known as the money multiplier. In order to do this, what we can do is take our reserve ratio. So our reserve ratio in this instance was 10%. And our money multiplier says we take 1 divided by that 10%, and we find that our money multiplier is equal to 10, right? 1 divided by 0.1, right? It was 10%. 1 divided by 0.1 is 10. And then we take that money multiplier and multiply it by our excess reserves. Now, our excess reserves in this case was $900, right? That original 100 of Alex's 1,000 was required reserves. The other 900 was excess. So if we take 10 times 900, we see if we were to continue to do that loan deposit, it would equal $9,000 of new money that could be created by the banks. Now, is this how it actually works? The Bank of England released a statement back in 2014, and what they said was, while the money multiplier theory that we just talked about is a useful way of introducing money in banking in economic textbooks, it's not really an accurate description of how money is created in reality. There's been 3 competing theories over the past century and a half: the financial intermediation theory, the fractional reserve theory, and the credit creation theory. But tests showed that financial intermediation and fractional reserve theories are not supported by evidence. Well, if that's the case, then what's going on? Well, what we end up seeing is that the facts are consistent with that credit creation theory. What that means is that banks can individually create credit out of nothing, and they do this when they extend credit or extend a loan. The loan is granted by the bank. It's reflected in an increase in the assets by the amount of the loan. The borrower receives the money when the bank credits the borrower's account with the bank by the amount of the loan. Here's what that's saying. Let's say I go to the bank and I want to buy a house, and I have to take out a mortgage, right? I need to take out a mortgage for $200,000 to buy a house. Does the bank have to have $200,000 in actual cold hard cash to hand over to me so that I can buy a house? Well, no. What do they have to have? A computer that they can change the numbers on, right? All they have to do is go into the computer and credit my account with $200,000, right? That's what they mean by receives the money when the bank credits the borrower's account. Now, what we see is that since banks work as the accountants of record, the rest of the economy assumes that they're honest accountants. But by simply altering the figures, no one else is going to notice. They can increase the money in the accounts of some of us because the agents can't distinguish between the money that's been saved and deposited or the money that's been created out of nothing. We're seeing that money in banking is kind of changing, right? We see this credit creation theory is well in action, that banks are creating money. Now, is it reckless? No, so don't worry. But we see that money is actually being created in this way.